Welcome to our second discussion of Marc Bloch's very insightful, very interesting, I think very important book, The Historian's Craft. This book has the potential for us in this course of shedding some really important, innovative thinking about the nature of history and the nature of historical understanding. At the same time, I have to acknowledge it is a challenging book to read, and probably especially challenging for you, because it reflects Bloch's own thought processes as an experienced, intelligent, and creative historian, but in a way which is not really organized as an orderly treatment or treatise on historical methods. Instead, what you see as you read through the book is a set of problems, a set of problems of historical thinking, historical cognition, which are woven throughout the book. And the book is also interspersed with some very concrete and fascinating examples from Bloch's own research as a medieval historian. In fact, Bloch questions the assumptions that both historians and educated readers often make about the past and about how to understand the past. Assumptions about periods, historical social systems, whether it's Roman slavery or medieval feudalism. The significance of centuries in our analysis of history. Is the 12th century a useful unit of analysis? Is the 19th century a real historical period? He questions also assumptions about social categories like serfs and servitude, and so many other fascinating assumptions which are shattered by Marc Bloch's careful dissection of the cases which he considers. You could almost describe this book as being a phenomenology of the historical researcher. Phenomenology is maybe a word which is unfamiliar to you. It is a field of philosophy, of German philosophy and eventually French philosophy, which examines the details and particulars of human experience from the point of view of the first person. So I examine my experience of eating a baguette, or my experience of watching the birds as they flutter through the trees outside my house. And Husserl, the German philosopher Husserl, is the late 19th, early 20th century philosopher who developed the theory of phenomenology. To me, much of the historian's craft has the feeling of it being a phenomenology of the intellectual and practical experience of investigating, dissecting, and understanding historical facts. This book is kind of analogous to the reflections of a great biologist, reflecting upon and analyzing her own efforts over 30 years to solve empirical puzzles in the laboratory and in the field, and to make sense of the phenomena which she has studied. These processes, whether for the historian or for the biologist, are both skills which can be communicated and passed on to other researchers, but they are also creative acts, which the researcher himself or herself doesn't necessarily even fully understand. Acts through which an intelligent inquirer is probing nature, in the case of the biologist, or history, in the case of Marc Bloch, in order to uncover its processes and mechanisms. And the process which Marc Bloch is interested in kind of unpacking and revealing to us is the process of historical analysis, the process of judging, understanding, synthesizing, dissecting, and presenting. And in fact, many instances in the book are directly phenomenological, directly expressing of experiences in Marc Bloch's own practice as an historian. So here's one quote I wanted to share with you. I have before me a Roman funerary inscription carved from a single block made for a single purpose. Yet nothing could be more variegated than the evidences which there await the probing of the scholar's lancet. And Bloch then goes on to consider the various angles which can be used, the historian can use, to probe the meaning and the implications of the inscription but also the implications which the inscription has for the society from which it emerged. And so he talks about linguistic evidence, he talks about the evidence of religious beliefs, he talks about the evidence which the inscription may shed on political history. The inscription may shed light on economics and trade. In other words, this one object can have implications for many different pieces of historical research. We're today talking about the last 3 chapters of the book, and they are complex. I, at one point, was kind of thinking of trying to provide you with a careful, annotated translation of the book into a few simple points, but really it's too complex for that. But these are some of the questions which are central in the last 3 chapters of the book. First, how to evaluate historical evidence, how to take the markers or footprints of the past, which we currently have in front of us as historians, and to evaluate their truthfulness, and the question of what inferences do they support about the past. Secondly, and this is probably the part of the book which Marc Bloch attributes the greatest amount of time to, or devotes the greatest amount of time to, is the question about how to construct at appropriate and useful historical concepts and classifications through which to analyze and describe and discuss the arrangements of the past. There is also the problem of selectivity, the problem of selection. How do historians select from the infinite detail of the Roman Empire? How to select specific aspects which can be investigated and analyzed and understood by the historian. And then another important subject, I won't say it's the final subject, but another important subject, Bloch pays a lot of attention to the question of how to synthesize and understand the phenomena which have been identified in detail. And so these 4 questions might be put as the kind of the central challenges for the historian, and all of them are treated in these remaining 3 chapters. So let's talk about documents first. In a sense, this is the simplest part of Marc Bloch's writings in these chapters. He makes the point that documents do not speak for themselves. He is a medieval historian, and he has spent a great deal of time and effort on the problem of discovering, uncovering, reading, deciphering, and then attributing meaning and significance to the documents of a town or a city or a medieval manor. But one thing which he notes is that documents do not bring their own meaning and truthfulness on their surface. Rather, lies and deception are a part of reading documents. The documents often lie. Documents sometimes have a propagandistic purpose. Bloch actually refers to his own experience in World War I and eventually World War II, the way in which government documents are presented in a way which is intended to influence the public rather than to express the truth. He spends a good deal of time on a topic which we talked about last week, which is the cognitive limits of direct observers and participants as witnesses to history. This is a completely fascinating subject because it's valid for the observer of a medieval transaction or a battle in the Roman Empire or the kind of the conduct of World War II. He talks about, it's really very interesting to us in the context in which we find ourselves, he talks about fake news and rumors and the ways in which false beliefs about the world are promulgated in a very deliberate way. And he talks at some length about the fabrication of documents, literally the effort to deceive either contemporaries or possibly future readers by making up documents which claim to establish one set of facts, but which are really complete fabrications. His account of Galileo and the idea that there was a predecessor to Galileo, this is really both comical and also very interesting, the fraud which was perpetrated. So he goes into some detail about the fact that historians from about 1700 onward are not confused by the fact that documents require interpretation, they require a careful probing, they require almost the investigations of a detective to try to figure out, is this a truthful document? Is it a partial document? Is it a biased document? And this is what he refers to as the critical method of interrogating documents which the historian is working with. He makes the point that earlier historians generally regarded documents as being the only evidence and therefore the decisive and definitive evidence about the earlier period. But critical historians no longer adopted that stance. They no longer believed that simply because a document says that a certain possession was given to the serfs to make their lives better, the document says that, but critical historians were unwilling to simply take at face value what those statements were. And Bloch goes into a lot of practical detail, I'm not going to summarize here, about how to assess and critically evaluate medieval documents, to compare with other documents of the same time period, to consider spelling and orthography. Is this document written on the right kind of paper? And to consider internal dates and persons who are mentioned in the article, in the document. So using other sources of evidence to come to an evaluation of the authenticity and the veridicality, the truthfulness of the document, Bloch goes into some detail there. And it's very interesting detail, but it's also kind of straightforward. Once you have the idea that we need to find some kind of evidence to allow us to evaluate the authenticity and truthfulness of a document, then the kinds of considerations that Bloch offers are kind of straightforward. More subtle, more challenging, and taking up more of the discussion is the question of arriving at conceptual systems and ways of abstracting from the full complexity of history to the language which the historian is forced to use in order to probe and investigate and ask questions. So Bloch has a great deal to say about the importance of providing conceptual frameworks for representing aspects of the past. And he urges all of us to be alert to ways in which the given abstraction which we've arrived at may in fact mislead us. And he gives a very nice example from family law, extending the idea of studying family law from the late Middle Ages. You'll see in a minute that Middle Ages is not a concept that he likes, but let's say from the 12th century to the 18th century, studying family law. And he takes the point, this is a quote, "Take the family, whether it be a question of the small matrimonial family of today in a state of perpetual expansion and contraction, or of the great medieval house, that community consolidated by such a lasting network of feelings and interests." So his point is that the concept of the family, and then references to the family in successive systems of law, may seem to be referring to the same social reality, but in fact, the family changed dramatically throughout that period. And so if we were uncritical in our use of family law or the concept of the family, we would be making a lot of erroneous assumptions both about the past and the present. This is a nice quote I wanted to read to you, and this has to do with abstraction of different aspects of human experience. So here's the quote. "As for homo religiosus, homo economicus, homo politicus, and all that rigmarole of Latinized men, the list of which we could string out indefinitely, there is grave danger of mistaking them for something else than they really are, phantoms which are convenient providing they do not become nuisances. The man of flesh and bone, reuniting them all simultaneously, is the only real being." So he's making a really important point here. When the economist says, okay, I'm going to consider human beings as being economically rational, I will consider them as homo economicus, and then I will consider how they behave. And a sociologist comes along and says, well, I'm going to consider human beings as spiritual beings with religious beliefs. That's homo religiosus. And I will give you an account of historical behavior, individual behavior based on these assumptions. Well, Bloch's point is these are all abstractions from the mentality of the human being in the Roman period or the medieval period or the modern period. But the human being actually embodies all of these identities, all of these forms of reasoning and thinking, and all of these value systems. And so Bloch is really reminding us that the abstraction should not be replaced for the full historical reality. He, as an historian, is fascinated with names of things. And he gives some really excellent examples. We've mentioned the example of the plow, but he uses the Latin term aratrum and points out that this refers in the early text to a plow without wheels, and the feruca, a plow with wheels. And this is a technologically kind of earth-shattering, almost literally earth-shattering technological advance, because the wheeled plow was capable of breaking up much heavier soils and therefore extended agriculture into northern France. But how do you know when the feruca, when the wheeled plow, made its appearance on the scene? Well, there are several sources of evidence that are possible, but one is documents. And when is the rutrum referred to? When is the feruca referred to? But he makes the point that this is not a perfectly clear linguistic regularity, because a rutrum continues to be used in some texts to refer to plows with wheels, and feruca, there are similar complexities about the Latin term feruca. In other words, this is a linguistic or conceptual linguistic complexity which is found in the documents, but which really needs to be sorted out by the historian if he is to be able to make use of those documents to make substantive claims about the history of technology. Maybe a slightly more substantive, important point is the Latin term servus, S-E-R-V-U-S, servus, which comes from the Latin period, the Latin Empire, or the Roman Empire, from Latin language, and then its linguistic successor, serf, which is used in French in medieval France. These conceptual similarities, these linguistic similarities from the Roman Empire to medieval France suggest similar social realities. But what Bloch points out is that, here I'm quoting, the differences between the serfs of ancient Rome and the serf of the France of St. Louis far outnumber the similarities. In fact, the serf of ancient Rome should really be understood as slave, and the social condition and the system of coercion and exploitation and so forth that was involved in serfdom was quite different from that of slavery. But the linguistic similarity may make us think that there's a lot in common between serfs in ancient Rome and serfs in medieval France. He also notes the equivalence, which is sometimes established by historians, between serf and the Eastern European Slavic word krepostnoi. But what he points out is that these two terms, which are thought to be interchangeable, or which are treated as being interchangeable, actually designated vastly different social realities. A much harsher form of bondage in the East, which corresponded really to a system closer to slavery, and serfs in the West had more freedoms. This interest in names is really an interest in the cognition of historical reality. The cognition of historical reality. How do we construct mental frameworks, conceptual frameworks for breaking down and verbally representing the reality of different time periods? And you could call this the philosophy of historical language. Now I'm going to take a little break here and pop into philosophy of language to introduce you to a distinction in the philosophy of language. Terms like gold or serf have been analyzed as in two very different ways. Some philosophers have tried to understand proper nouns or category nouns like serf as being, or actually let's take metal or gold as the example, as natural kind terms. A natural kind term is a term which designates a set of properties that define the essential characteristics and behavior of the items. And so a metal, all metals, whether they're gold or silver or lead or iron, all metals share a set of molecular properties, atomic properties, which define the essential characteristics and behavior of the items. But that concept doesn't work very well in the social world or the historical world. The concepts which Bloch refers to, we could better understand as being cluster concepts. And what do I mean by that? A cluster concept is a concept defined in terms of a loose set of properties which are shared by many instances of the terms or of the items, but which are not thought to define the basic nature of the items. So if servitude is a cluster concept, it identifies the fact that slaves and serfs and possibly wage laborers in Birmingham, England or Manchester, England, they all have some kind of servitude in common, but the important characteristics of their social relationships are substantially different. So a cluster concept allows us to identify a phenomenon for study, but it doesn't tell us very much about how that phenomenon is constituted or how it works. Rather, we have to do sociological and historical research to understand how serfs are different from slaves and different from wage laborers. Now I'm going to refer to some of the questions which Bloch raises about traditional historical assumptions. The idea that there are distinctive social and economic systems in the world which can be identified and kind of placed with a kind of historical certainty. He refers to a distinction which is, for anyone who's not a student of the history of the medieval period, this will be maybe a confusing distinction. But he points out that the idea of a feudal system and the seigneurial system, that these two terms are used interchangeably, but he makes the point that this interchangeable use of the terms is actually completely misleading. So quoting from Bloch, this is arbitrarily to equate the complex, dependent ties characteristic of a warrior aristocracy, that's feudalism, with a type of peasant subjection which not only was very different by nature, but had arisen very much earlier, lasted much longer, and was far more widespread throughout the world. So the point he's making here is that the feudal system is actually a much more specific system of organized warfare and the economic support for organized warfare, whereas the bondage associated with the seigneurial system was a much more common, widespread, and historically more extended system of bondage to the land. Let's turn to large historical periods. We tend to think that the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, that these are convenient ways of capturing an historical epoch or an historical period. But Bloch thinks that these concepts are really quite arbitrary, that the associations that we have with the Middle Ages, let alone the Dark Ages or the medieval period, and the idea that that historical epoch is substantially different from the modern period or the early modern period or the Renaissance, his view is that that way of periodizing European history is very arbitrary. So here's a quote which I think captures it very well. In truth, the term Middle Age has no more than a humble pedagogical function as a debatable convenience for school curriculums, or as a label for erudite techniques whose scope is moreover ill-defined by the traditional dates. A medievalist is a man who knows how to read old scripts, to criticize a charter, to understand Old French. Unquestionably, that is something. It is certainly not enough to satisfy a real science in its search for accurate periodization. So he thinks the idea of thinking of the Middle Ages as a kind of consistent, coherent historical period to be studied, that there is no rationale for singling out the Middle Ages. And by implication, that would be true also for the classical world, and it would be true for the modern world. He even thinks that the tendency we have to think in terms of centuries, so I'm a 19th century historian, you are a 20th century historian, and our colleague is a 12th century historian, he thinks that centuries are a misleading historical construct. An idea which I find very interesting and is kind of related to the question of how to identify periods, but this is a way of identifying the experience that individuals have in time, and you can identify it as the point about cohorts in time. I'll read the quotation because I think it's a really interesting one. Men who are born into the same social environment about the same time necessarily come under analogous influences, particularly in their formative years. Experience proves that by comparison with either considerably older or considerably younger groups, their behavior reveals certain distinctive characteristics which are ordinarily very clear. This is true even of their bitterest disagreements. To be excited by the same dispute, even on opposing sides, is still to be alike. This common stamp, deriving from common age, is what makes a generation. Now, this is a very interesting point because there is kind of a dispute in the philosophy of history. Are human beings essentially all the same, or are there important differences across cohorts or across generations? Is the so-called greatest generation, the generation which fought World War II, is it very substantially different in its outlook, its mentality, its moral framework than the 60s generation? And what Bloch is saying here is that there are indeed these very substantial differences of values and frameworks, mental frameworks, moral frameworks, that individuals born into a certain time bear throughout their lives. He also makes a point which I appreciate about the heterogeneity of social life, whether in the present or in the past. Quoting, "Society, it is true, is not a single thing. It is split up into different social classes in which the generations do not always overlap. Do the forces acting upon a young worker necessarily operate, at least with equal intensity, upon a young peasant? Add to this that even in the best knit civilizations, the currents of dissemination are slow." So he's making a point about social differentiation. So we shouldn't expect homogeneous values, homogeneous outlooks, homogeneous perspectives within a society. Instead, we have to look to the specifics of peasant experience, worker experience, upper class experience, and so forth. So what is the significance of this book? Why was it important or useful for you to read the book? The book has been praised and celebrated since it was discovered and published after World War II and after Marc Bloch's death. But its real importance, I believe, as a person myself who has written on the philosophy of history, I think the importance and significance of this book has not been fully understood. Another book should be written about this book. In fact, I find it to be an amazingly rich expression of the intelligence and mental processes of a great historian. And it is an important contribution to the philosophy of history and to the philosophy of language in the context of historical analysis. I hope that your struggles in reading big chunks of the book, trying to understand what he's getting at and how it hangs together, I hope you will find, as we move through the course, that this thinking has paid off in terms of your ability to integrate and think about historical change and historical periods throughout global human history in a different way.